right, so now we are recording. Go ahead and proceed. Well, I'm going to pause recording first because I'm going to talk about course evaluations. No, resume share. I'm going to pause. So I didn't figure the internet needed to hear us talk about course evaluations, but anyway, go do the course evaluations, not just this class, other classes, please, for us. Okay. All right. Where are we at? Here's where we are. 2 days of class. We're done with labs. Yay. Now we're done with the labs. No lab Wednesday. Wednesday is just focused on review for test 5. I think I'm going to get just about everything that I want to talk about in 18 and 19 done today. Let's see where it goes. I was putting material together kind of at the last minute. I'm pretty happy about what I've got ready for you guys tonight. But if we get through it and I look at it, I'm like, nah, let's hit these other topics also. On Wednesday, we'll do that. Okay, so maybe a little bit of 18 and 19 again on Wednesday. But really focus on review for test 5. The 18, 19, and then really just kind of the big high points from the rest of the semester. Okay, that's really going to be kind of the goal. Again, I just didn't feel it was right to do an entire test on just 2 chapters that we're going to spend 1 day talking about. So, and then the actual test it'll be scheduled the same time as a final for a Monday, Wednesday 5:40 classes. Wednesday the 12th at 5:40. I'll go ahead and make sure that upstairs in 201 is available so we can go up there and take it. That way it's done, graded. You guys get results. Okay. Questions about that? There's mine. Okay. Awesome. So let us talk about chapters 18 and 19. It's going to be our focus today. This is where we introduce the concept of evolution. Remember, weeks ago, months ago, almost seems like decades ago now in this kind of year, we talked about the 8 criteria for an organism to be considered alive. Back in the other room over there across the way. Number 8 was the idea of evolution. Right? We said at that time, that's when an adaptation or mutation provides an organism an advantage. The organism must be able to pass on genes required for that adaptation. One of the criteria that today we use to define life is this idea of evolution. Okay. What is evolution? Well, textbook definition would tell us it's the mechanism for how species change over time. Now, I'd be remiss if I don't try to approach the elephant in the room here. I am not interested in your religious beliefs, and I'm not going to share mine with you. Right? You have them, you don't, that's fine. It's not our concern here. I've really kind of thought about what is the best way to approach this. For some people, this is a big sticking point. Let's not let it be a sticking point. Let's talk about what science has learned in the last 2 centuries about the topic, and talk about what kind of where it looks like it's headed. I'll say this: for some reason this sticks out in my mind. My 6th grade science teacher, I think it's 6th grade, middle school science teacher. One time I remember he said to us, religion will tell you about who created the universe and who created it. Science tells us how it was done. And how you as an individual, how you want to put those two together spiritually, religiously. That's one of the beautiful things about living in this country. We have the opportunity, you can do that. I'm not interested in influencing your view. Okay, that's not my goal. My goal is to talk to you about what we've learned in the last couple of centuries about evolution and how organisms change and what we've seen. Some of this we've actually seen in real time. Some of this we've learned more and more through the fossil records. And now that we can actually study, we understand what genetics actually are and how it's transmitted, which is knowledge that we've really just achieved in the last century. Now we actually have measurable results that we can show how this occurs. I thought this was one of the best examples I could point to. My wife and I, we do this little thing. We call it the zoo review. We visit different zoos. It's something we do together. We visit zoos, we write up reviews, and we try to promote people to visit zoos. Okay, and so this is something I've got quite a bit of knowledge about. And I've seen an exhibit like this before at some zoos, and I thought this was really cool. Right, this is not ours. This is not one of our pictures. I borrowed this from another blog. What do you think? What animal is this? Who knows this? Any guesses? What do you think?
Like a giraffe.
Looks like a giraffe.
Yeah, I don't think it's a giraffe.
Looks like a bird.
Think it's a bird? It's not a bird. It's a mammal. Right? We can gather some things about where are the teeth placed on it.
Maybe it was a herbivore.
The herbivore, right? It looks like it's got some kind of dentition up front, but most of the teeth, real good grinders in the back. That tells us it's probably a herbivore. Okay? Giraffe's a really good guess. What about this one? That's a giraffe. That's a giraffe. Right? Absolutely. That's a giraffe. You put the two together, right? Okapi is the one on the left. Okapi is the one on the left. And I really thought that this was probably the best way that I can start this off of the mechanism of how species change over time. The okapi and the giraffe, and this is actually, this is a collection of small wife's pictures here. And so we've got here a giraffe and okapi exhibiting almost the exact same behavior. Slightly different structure. A lot of you, the common misconception is you look at the okapi because of the stripes on its back legs, and it's kind of like about the size of a horse. You think, oh, it's a zebra relation. No, it's not. Zebras are related to horses. Okapis and giraffes are actually closely related. In fact, they're the same family in the Giraffidae family. The American antelope, the pronghorn antelope, is actually a closer relative to this Giraffidae family than it is an antelope. That's another story. Let's not go down that path. Okay, so okapi and giraffe, and again, you can see, and this is the study of bones, which the name escapes me for the moment. The study of bones, and especially the study of dentition, the study of teeth, is some of the mechanisms that scientists really had before we understood genomes and could actually sequence genomes. Some of the most powerful tools we had to actually study what animals were related and why, and do they share common ancestry. Skull structure, bone structure, teeth structure are a lot of times one of our biggest indicators. Okay, I found this on the internet. It's got its source nicely presented down there out of a well-published magazine. I know it's kind of hard to read. I'll read it with you here. Two views of evolution and Darwin's original concept: change occurs gradually. I'm reading this paragraph right here. Change occurs gradually as better adapted individuals in each generation survive and pass on other traits. In the punctuated model, that's this one on the left, where they're saying we're going from this pre-okapi straight to the okapi that we see in modern day, and a little more discombobulated path to get to the giraffe, right? And that's in the punctuated model. Changes come rapidly when a new species forms. The better adapted species survive, others become extinct. Right, so this is what we found, and each species is a little bit different, but what we find on the right is a little more typically what would happen, a little more gradual change from a common ancestor to what we would see in the modern presentation today. But again, this is when I saw this graphic and I saw this article, nice scientific published journal article here talking about the giraffe genome. And when I saw that, I'm like, all right, that's measurable results. We've got to talk about giraffes and okapi. Okay, and so to understand a little bit about what's going on here, what this journal article did is, and at least the results we're presenting here, they're talking about comparing giraffe to cattle, Bos taurus, domestic cattle. Okay, comparing giraffe to cattle, the proteins that those organisms produce internally, which is coded in their genome, coded in their nucleic acid. About 9 to 10% proteins are identical for domestic cattle to giraffes. Okay? You look at the two, they're both herbivores, they both walk on 4 legs. You'd expect more similarity than that. No, only about 9 to 10% the same for those two. And then you compare okapi to cattle, again, about 9 to 10%. You compare okapi to giraffe, twice the amount of identical proteins, twice the amount of genetic inheritance between the two, meaning they are from a common ancestor, much closer in the fossil records, most closer in geologic time than you see. It's a further branch back here to something like domestic cattle. And now, again, because we can actually look at the genomes of these organisms, we can compare sequences, right, the similarities between the sequences. We can actually quantify this information now, something we've not been able to do until the last couple of decades. Okay. Again, our understanding of what I'm trying to hammer home to you. I went and glanced, and the best I could find is, well, we're going to talk about timeline here in a second. Before I'm not going to steal my thunder. I was going down a rabbit hole. I'm not going to steal my thunder here. Just understand that what we understand about evolution today is completely different than and much improved over what we understood of evolution even just 20 years ago. Okay? And much improved over what we understood of it 100 years ago. Right? And it's not even close to what we understood about it 2 decades ago, or I'm sorry, 2 centuries ago. And so I can posit this here. I looked up last night, when was the first recorded dinosaur fossil discovered? And best I could tell, somewhere in the early 1820s, there was an iguanodon. At least most sources point to the discovery and crediting of an iguanodon was discovered in the 1820s. Not too long before Mendel did his work in genetics, which again, Mendel didn't even necessarily understand chromosomes or what we understand today about genetic heritability. That comes later. So again, just in 2 centuries, from the 1800s, science is really just starting to hit on this, okay? So just a little bit of the timeline here. We don't have to go real in depth, but just a few of the players here. Lamarck here, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Interesting gentleman. I read a little bit about him. Born in the mid-1700s. Fighting in a war when he was like 12 years old for like 20 years. It's a different time in the 1700s, obviously. Anyway, about the 1800s, he's become a distinguished scientist and distinguished biologist. And he's come up with he's one of the first credited, noted sources of the concept of biological evolution. Organisms adapt to local environmental changes and that they can inherit characteristics from their parents. And posited that, he suggested the idea that organisms become more complex through time. Now, a little bit later, and I'm probably going to butcher this last name, Charles Lyell, in 1830s, still early 1800s, not even 1850 yet. He's actually a geologist, or at least that's his focus, is in geology. And again, fossils were really just starting to become something that we as a species were beginning to even look at. Prior to this point, we were under the assumption that, and understandably, we're under this assumption that species are what they've always been and always will be. Life is life. It is what it is. There wasn't even the understanding that there were species that used to exist on this planet that no longer exist. That was not, when we're talking in the 1800s and 1700s, these are completely foreign ideas. This was not known knowledge. There were species that used to live and no longer exist today, right? So Charles Lyell is this geologist that's beginning to really start looking at fossilized remains within the geologic structures and beginning to draw some conclusions to what he's seeing there. Okay? And he's coming up with this idea that external conditions, because he's a geologist, he's also beginning to understand that the rate at which the Earth was formed and the landscape that we see, the rate of how it was formed, over what time period it was formed, and how the organisms that lived on that land, stored in the fossil records, how they changed over time. So that's kind of the foundational work. And again, keep in mind, science wasn't aware of Mendel's work until 1900s. Mendel didn't even do his work until like 1830s and 1850s, which is about the time, 1830s is when Charles Darwin famously is credited with evolution, and that's understandable. We'll talk about why in a second. But he's taking journeys on the HMS Beagle to various places, remote places around the world, one of those being the Galapagos Islands. Now, based on, he had recently read Lyell's publication of Principles of Geology, learning more about the way the landscapes had formed, the time period that it took for landscapes to form. The Galapagos Islands being these structures that formed under different conditions, under different timeline than most of the continents. Okay? And so the organisms that evolved there, of course, exhibit a different behavior, a different evolutionary behavior than we see in most other species on mainland that typically are pretty stable in terms of their evolution rates and pretty slow. So it's kind of this laboratory where it was actually able to notice. A lot of times we talk about Darwin's finches, and that's the lab that we did in class. Those we did in class alternative. We actually looked a little bit at beak shapes and how beak shapes, given certain environmental conditions, may be more successful than others. The idea of descent with modification. That's all species descended from some common life forms, and ultimately back to one common life form, which probably will never have any way of actually proving or disproving. But the evidence points to this narrowing tree, some common ancestor amongst similar species. You see that with the giraffe and the okapi. You see that with Darwin's finches. Darwin also made observations with the Galapagos tortoises, the famous Galapagos tortoises. The text talks about that, on some of the islands where most of the vegetation was in trees, where the turtles would have a longer neck, especially a lot longer than that you would see on other environments where the turtles would just graze on grass or other vegetation. So the long-necked Galapagos tortoises, they evolved this long neck because the ones that could reach the trees and get to the leaves were more likely to be successful. Now, also, the lesser-known Alfred Russel Wallace. So Darwin, again, taking his voyages, doing his observations in the early 1830s, Wallace comes along in the late 1850s, and really kind of the 1830s through the 1850s. He's doing research in the Amazon as well as some other places. He's also come to this conclusion about evolution through natural selection. Right? So he's put together quite a bit of documentation, quite a bit of research, and he's come up with the idea that new species arise by continued divergence of varieties that outlive the parent species in the struggle for existence. This idea that, this particular beetle with something about the environment that this beetle with these long pincers here, something about this particular shape allowed this beetle to be more successful, as opposed to, this beetle or these smaller beetles that don't have the large pincers. Something in those environments allowed those beetles to be more successful than the other generations of those beetles that have smaller or less pronounced pincers. And so he's able to document differences between species. And then again, considering the geography, how does the landscape impact, how the environmental conditions impact which animals are successful and which animals are not? And that's really, again, the basis. I'm talking about my slides here through the section titled Evolution of Evolution. This is how, the timeline of how we got to where we are today. Now again, Wallace sent Darwin his thoughts, his manuscript, and then the two ended up both publishing manuscripts. And we typically credit Darwin with the theory of evolution, and it was definitely a massive contributing factor. Just like we saw with DNA, the person that gets the credit is not the only person involved. But Darwin he authored a text on the origin of species. And so he's typically the person we attach the father of evolution to Darwin. That's for that reason. His text, his manuscript on the origin of species, puts together all of the ideas associated with, again, Lyell, Wallace, and his own observations, builds them all together. Okay. And again, just to see it, we've kind of mentioned this a little bit, but just to see it graphically here, right? Environment, genetics, and evolution, they all work together to determine how organisms evolve, right? And so again, just if we actually physically see or visibly see here the timeline, again, Mendel down here on genetics and evolution, different paths initially, right? And kind of originating here with Darwin in 1859, Wallace and Darwin really kind of putting things together. And then Mendel up to about 1865 is when he's kind of wrapping up his Pease experiments. And then other additional work being done. Again, Mendel's records were kind of lost for a period of time, and then they resurfaced when there was more interest finally. So the 1900s is when we really start looking at and start getting an understanding that chromosomes are actually what's communicating heritability. We knew organisms were passing on genetics, we weren't sure how. When we figured out that's occurring through chromosomes and through DNA structure, or through DNA molecules. And again, the idea of evolution being dependent on environments and how that ties to being able to pass on genes, that finally merges in about the 1930s, 1940s, not even a century ago. A lot of science, look at mathematics. Mathematics has not changed much for almost a millennium. This is something that we are constantly, pardon the pun, evolving. Our understanding of how organisms evolve is constantly evolving. And again, that understanding is less than a century old from this point forward. Okay, and even in its infancy is less than 2 centuries old. So it's understandable that it's not always widely understood. You're going to encounter some controversy. I'm not going to be the best person to tell you how to deal with that. Happy to give you my thoughts, but not in class. And so this is what we're looking at. And again, if you look at what we're doing today, right, we have much more understanding of how the plate tectonics, how the continents drifted, right? There was a period of time when you had all the continents were together, one large continent we call Pangea. So if you look at geology, and that's something we really didn't completely understand, that's something else we're still understanding more and more of all the time. But there was a period of time where all the organisms, not in 1960, it's just our understanding of it occurred in 1960. But there was a period of time in the past where all the continents were one single continent. And so all the organisms could kind of migrate, didn't have to migrate over oceans. And then the continents separated. And again, if you look at what we've done literally just in the last few decades, our ability now to actually measure organisms' ability to transmit genetics, transmit heritability, our ability, we've actually mapped the genome. We know the actual sequence of DNA molecules, or at least we have a way to figure out the sequence of DNA molecules. Right? You guys remember in the lab when we smashed up the strawberry and we extracted what's you guys referred to as snot, and I would refer to it as snot also, this blob of DNA, right? This squishy blob of DNA. Imagine that we have the ability now, it's not easy, but we have the ability now to figure out from that bulb what the order, not just how many, but what the order of A, C, G, and T are in those molecules. And that's, again, just in the last couple of decades. Now we can do that, and we can compare different species to one another. So some terms here. Natural selection shows up on the next slide, so we can focus on the first three. I know it's a little small, but write in some major terms down here. Species. Species is a group of individuals that interbreed readily and produce fertile, viable offspring. For example, horses and donkeys, very closely related. They are actually capable of interbreeding and produce what we call a mule. Almost always the mule is infertile. Cross between a horse and a donkey cannot. The terrible joke is don't let somebody sell you a mule farm. If you buy a farm where there's just a bunch of mules, you're not going to have any more mules after that. They don't produce more mules unless you buy horses and donkeys. Those are different species. Now, there are some species that we have been able to actually hybridize, and sometimes what we call species, there are some instances where they will produce offspring, and that typically just tells us that those two species diverged recently. They're probably still very closely related, but they probably come from some common ancestor not too far in the past. But in general, if we have to, so I guess what I'm saying is, it's nice to point to this definition and say it's a hard black and white line between species, and I'm just telling you, well, it's sometimes a little gray. Right? But with that said, for example, lions and tigers, those are two animals that, in theory, we can create a hybrid of those, and we have. And in theory, that hybrid is sometimes also viable. It can actually produce offspring. But geographically, those animals normally will not commingle. Same thing with polar bears and grizzly bears. There are documented cases of hybrids of those species. Rare, but they do occur. And we still consider those separate species because, in general, they do not intermix. Speciation is where we create two species from some common ancestor. Hybrid and speciation. Natural selection. Natural selection, again, that's on the next slide here. Natural selection is reproduction of individuals with favorable traits that survive environmental change. So the idea of natural selection is individuals that are able to seek out food, are able to reproduce more prolifically, are able to utilize the space that's available, able to attract mates in some cases. The organisms that do that the best are the ones that are more likely to pass their genetics on to the next generation. They get selected naturally to be represented in the next generation. What causes this? Well, again, organisms are constantly trying to compete for food. They're going to go hunt, as this little guy's doing here, or at least he's practicing hunting. Again, they've got to be able to have a location, a space, a territory sometimes where they can safely raise their young or deposit their young in a place where they can theoretically grow safely. They've got to have an opportunity to actually reproduce. So these are, again, pressures that will cause natural selection. These are environmental conditions. And again, natural selection tells us basically we're selecting specific adaptations. So an adaptation is a heritable trait that helps an organism's survival and reproduction in its present environment. So borrowed. I've got a few graphics here I borrowed from another instructor. This is one of them. I don't know where she got it from. Terrible, really, but the basic idea is you can see the organism. If we're talking about giraffes, we'll continue on that discussion there. The adaptation of a longer neck, especially when we compare those to an okapi, right? Both okapi and giraffe have got long, dark tongues to prevent those tongues from getting sunburned. They can use those long tongues to grab leaves, but the okapis live in the forest where they don't necessarily need longer necks. Where the giraffes live on large plains, in theory they could eat the grass, but it's much better for them to eat tall trees. Trees get taller and taller, so they need longer and longer necks to get to those tall trees. Because the other organisms that are lower to the ground, they eat the leaves that grow first. So, again, an adaptation is any heritable trait that helps an organism's survival and reproduction in its present environment. Remember we talked about the environment's not, well, we talked about the continents and continental drift. The environment is not fixed. That's what we have to understand. The environment's not fixed. From one generation to the next, the environment can change. So sometimes the natural selection will go one way and then very quickly will go another. But the variation, what we call variation, so the adaptations, does this one work? Yeah, there we go. Adaptation. And then variation. Now, remember, so variation is differences in the genotypes in the population. Okay? So phenotype is what is exhibited. Genotype is what is actually coded. So if you've got a dominant allele, your genotype, you've got one dominant, one recessive, the genotype is heterozygous, to where that trait, the heritable trait, might show up or it might not show up. The variation is talking about the genotypes that are present. And are they all homozygous for the dominant? Or there's some heterozygous in there, so the recessive trait may show up in the next generation. And remember, we've talked a little bit about, and this shows up in this discussion as well, the idea of the wild type versus the variants. And so the wild type is what we typically see in the majority of the population. Now, two major types of evolution. This doesn't get all types of evolution, but there are two big categories of evolution. One is what we call divergent evolution. That's where you've got a common ancestor. And then you have different variations emerge within the species. But they retain a lot of the common traits. I thought this one's out of your text. I thought it's a really good graphic. I had forgotten that whales' flippers have fingers in them. And you know that whales have hind legs. They have bones for hind legs. They don't act, and it's, as best I can tell, I've learned this a little bit. I'm not going to claim to be an expert here, but best I can tell that the hind legs and the pelvis in most whale species doesn't actually attach to the spine. They just kind of float within the body. They're anchored. They don't float. That's not the right way to say it. But they're not necessarily tied to the spinal column like we see in most of the mammalian species. But the bones are still there. And we see in some fossil records where they just became progressively less pronounced. But they still needed those front flippers, right, to actually move through the water and be able to change direction. So having some digits in there, they could change the shape of those fins is a pretty good variation, good adaptation to have. But they adapted to live in the water, and so over time, adapted the traits that allowed them to be more successful in the water became more and more pervasive. As opposed to the animals that evolved for land, different sets of traits became more and more pervasive. Another large category of evolution would be what we call convergence. So you have divergent evolution. Divergent is where you've got common ancestry. And diverges. Traits diverge. As opposed to convergent, although one of the best illustrations here was three different groups of animals that fly, capable of flight, where you have different ancestral species capable of different traits. But over time, for whatever reason, small mammalian species first decided that it could glide through the air. Oh man. So convergence. So again, for whatever reason, the early ancestor of bats decided that it needed to be able to probably move from tree to tree. We're not sure we know, honestly. That's okay. So they began using skin between their forelimbs and their back limbs, right, to generate kind of this parachute or this gliding mechanism. Well, bats took it to the extreme. They actually evolved webbing, continuous webbing from those back legs all the way up to their fingers, and their fingers became elongated. So that's what they use as a wing, is basically skin between their fingers, their hands, all the way down to their feet. And because they've got bone structure, these are basically their fingers, because they can actually use those fingers then. They can actually change the shape of that wing, and they can actually use that to move through the air. Birds are able to move through the air and control that flight through the use of feathers. They're able to kind of change the direction those feathers face into or face with the air flowing over them. And use that to create lift and drag in that fashion. Insects also reached flight, completely different mechanism. Whereas if both birds and bats, they're using their forelimbs, so some common ancestor with four different limbs, and then eventually they converge to both using their front limbs to do that. Insects, of course, have got 6 legs, and they've got wings outside of that, so they're not using their limbs to maintain flight. They control their flight by having typically two different sets of wings that they can change and move independent of each other. And that's how they can change their lift and drag to be able to move and control their flight. Or in the case of June bugs, just crash into whatever. If you don't know what I mean, you'll see it in a couple weeks. Questions here so far? All right. How does this happen? What are some reasons? We've talked about some of these. Why do we not have identical offspring? Parents. What are some mechanisms that cause this? Second, all around. Talk amongst yourselves if you need to. Let's come up with some reasons. Why don't we look just like the
Mutation, crossover,
what was the first one?
mutation.
Yes. Mutations are one. There's the term crossover. What else? Yes. Some good ones, really good ones. One related also, so this occurs during meiosis. There was another one. Back. Independent. Assorted. We talked about during meiosis. Chromosomes to get down to the gametes independently just kind of shuffle. So you might get some chromosomes from the father and some chromosomes from the mother. And the alleles on those chromosomes will, because of crossover events, will get shuffled up before the chromosomes then get randomly separated into the gametes. So those two things together, definitely, we talked about during meiosis, that those definitely contribute to variation in sexual reproduction. We talked about genetics, where yes, depending on which alleles an individual inherits, and if they inherit one that's dominant over the other one, the dominant one will express. So I have genotype, but phenotypes look different. And then absolutely, mutations can occur. Just a simple 1 or 2 base pair change, an entire change or error within a chromosome, various ways that can occur. All of these result in different heredity, if you will, inheritance of different traits. So just an important thing to point out here. Mutation does not occur on purpose. Mutation does not, I'm just going to say that again. Mutation does not occur on purpose. To the best of our knowledge, we do not see organisms that intentionally mutate. What can happen is a mutation may cause a favorable adaptation that is easily selected for even within 1 or 2 generations naturally. A mutation may cause variation in a particular trait, a variant that is more successful than the wild type. And that variant then causes either a species to move a particular direction or a new species to develop all the same. Again, natural selection and evolution do not cause mutation. Mutation may occur on one chromosome and it's recessive to the dominant allele on the other chromosome. But then it shows up in the offspring. A number of things can happen. Now again, natural selection and evolution may allow a mutation to succeed and be selected in the next generation. They don't cause the mutation. Yeah, that's what I'm saying here. So my thunder. Natural selection and evolution allow organisms with favorable adaptations, might be resulting from mutation, be more successful, produce more offspring. And again, depending on dominance and recessiveness, those offspring may display the adaptation. If it's a dominant trait, or if it's recessive and they happen to get the trait from both parents, the allele from both parents. And another thing to mention, I probably haven't stressed this enough. very few traits are simply determined by one gene with one dominant and one recessive allele. Mendel really kind of lucked out. Mendel, and again, we're not sure if he just lucked out. Maybe he was a monk. Maybe he was guided by a higher presence. For whatever reason, he studied 7 traits that were, in fact, one dominant, one recessive allele. And they were on different chromosomes, so it was very easy to draw correct conclusions. Very few traits are that simple. Quite honestly, very few traits are that simple. Some are. Some definitely are. But again, natural selection, evolution allow certain traits that are favorable in a particular environmental condition to be more successful. And keep in mind the environment can change. We saw those of you that did the in-class lab, we saw that where one time I forgot to put some of the red beads out. Right? So the next generation was skewed because there wasn't that high energy food available. And the last time I said, well, there's a bunch of white beads, right? So we changed the environment and allowed certain beak shapes. But in all cases, the spoonbill died out very quickly for whatever reason. It is what it is. All right, just some additional terms that I've kind of grabbed some of the ones that I thought were important here, put them in here, mention these just a little bit. Population genetics. Most of these are from your text. Again, this is the direct quotes, no other source from your text. Population genetics. And that's this field of study where we're looking at the genotypes, specific allele frequencies. So we actually had to look at chromosomes, the coding on the chromosomes to know which alleles we're looking at, or at least look at the offspring and track back through pedigree analysis what allele frequency we're looking at. Right? And so allele frequency is the rate at which a specific allele appears within a population. Hardy-Weinberg principle that we will look at probably next time. We're not going to get to that today. That's okay. Looking at kind of a study describing mathematically allele frequency, laws, how the laws of probability apply to them. The gene pool, heard that term thrown around a lot. No, I have. It is a common term. Gene pool, fairly common language term. Not sure if we use it right all the time. The gene pool is the sum of all alleles present in a population. For a trait to be selected, the allele that causes that trait must be present in the population, must be present in the variation. If that allele does not exist in the population, it cannot be selected for. Again, evolution, natural selection do not cause mutations. They only allow those with favorable adaptations, mutations to be successful, be selected. So within the gene pool, the favorable adaptation, the favorable variant must exist. Now, how can it be selected? How can we drive, how is this driven? What are some examples of things we see that drive this change to occur, the selection to occur? And we're going to talk about each of these. You can write them down here, but we're going to go in order, talking just a little bit of each of these. I've borrowed these. These are from another instructor. I borrowed these. She won't mind. Right? She gave them to me and said, "Here, use what you want." Okay, I'll use these. So I thought she did a really good job talking about these. Again, there's 4 of them. If I back up here real quick: directional, distributive, stabilizing, and sexual. So we look at these in that order here. Directional selection. Right, so let's say that the phenotype in a particular moth species, and your text talks about there was a species of moth that, because of man-induced pollution, the surfaces that these moths survived on became darker. And so the birds were able to pick off the lighter colored ones on the darker colored surfaces easier. We call that directional selection. I don't remember the details again. I know it's in your text. As you're reading along, you'll catch it. And as I mentioned it, it'll be, oh yeah, Professor Fowler talked about that. Yeah, there was actually a documentable case in the last couple of centuries where scientists were actually able to observe this directional shift within this directional selection occurred because there was environmental change. So if the habitat, in this case, if the habitat, trees or surfaces those moths live on darkens, then the darker moths are more likely to survive, not be picked off by predators because they blend in. And so the species will shift in that direction. Your text also talks about a particular species of owl here in the United States that they're the same species, but they look radically different in different parts of the country. So belong in the western part of the United States. And I forget the species name off the top of my head, but I thought, and they showed a nice picture. I thought it was a really good example of this type of situation where in one particular environment, one variant is more successful than the other. Disruptive selection is, and that's what I was just describing. And I said this is actually a better example. The owls I was just describing is a better example of disruptive selection. Two extreme phenotypes are more fit for their particular environment. So in the case of, they're showing here in the case of some snails, where if the snails live on this reasonably uniform surface, then the medium coloration is probably going to be more successful because the more extreme colorations are going to be easier seen. The darker ones are easier seen on kind of this medium colored surface, and the light ones are going to be easier to see. So we're going to see more of the medium ones because they're more likely to survive. However, if the environment changes, they move to a different location where the rock coloration is different. Notice that the lighter color ones might be able to blend in with some light patches of the rock. The dark ones might blend in with the darker patches of rock. And so we can see that you see a dip, a disruption in the population to where one particular phenotype is less favorable. In this case, if the opposite ends of the spectrum, if the more extreme versions of that phenotype are more prolific, there's a good chance that we'll see two different species emerge from this type of an event. Most likely those two species of snails will get further and further apart in the traits that are successful. So maybe the rocks that this snail moves along are smoother, and so a lighter, heavier shell is okay, but these are rougher rocks, so it needs a lighter shell, just for example. A lot of possibilities. Another selection pressure that organisms can encounter. This one makes some sense. Stabilizing selection. And so in the case of birth weight, parents that generate kind of this medium range birth weight of babies, and this is true not just in humans, this is true in other species as well. Obviously, the larger infant, the larger baby size, there's going to be more difficulty during birthing process. The smaller ones are probably less likely to survive the babies or the infants are probably less likely to survive the environmental conditions. So over time, we'll probably see kind of a narrowing within a specific average range, and a narrowing of the selection pressure for a narrowing of this particular trait. Whether it's kind of hard to think about it sometimes as humans because we start tying emotion to it. But again, if you think about it in terms of other organisms, most likely that's the ones that are most likely, both the baby and the mother are most likely to survive. That's the condition that's going to get selected for naturally. And And then sexual selection, the competition for mates. Okay, so mechanisms of natural selection. Sometimes we'll see traits that may or may not make a lick of sense in terms of that individual's survival or fitness, but that trait may become more predominant. The peacock is a nice extreme example of that, where the male peacock has this massive tail with lots of coloration that he does this dance with, try to attract the attention of the females, and it's typically pretty effective. It says here, some traits cause an actual survival disadvantage. The peacock feather is a perfect example of that, where the longer and the bigger the tail is, the more likely that male is to woo the females, if you will. But at the same time, the more difficult it is for that peacock to escape predators with that big long tail. It's obviously not going to hide from predators very easily, so it's actually going to decrease its chances of survival. So there's kind of this cost benefit they're going to have to go through. But again, the prolific male will pass on his traits. So if the females are looking for larger tail size, then that's what will more likely be passed on to the next generation. But it's not uncommon that a lot of herbivore species, so we encounter that, will grow antlers and or horns that they can fight with each other. The larger horn structure or larger antlers, definitely harder to move around with, but they are good for defending yourselves and fighting off males, so you can control a larger population of females. When we see a difference between males and females, and we see this in many species, there's not, a huge difference for humans. There's obviously some, but when you look around the animal kingdom, we're not as extreme as a lot of other species. But this idea of sexual dimorphism, that's where you have a difference between the male and the female species. Some spider species are extreme examples of this, where the females, in general, female spiders are typically multiple times larger than the male, and often more pronounced colorations. Okay, so what we've talked about here, the last 4 slides, if I go back, the last 4 slides, we've talked about natural selection mechanisms. These are the things that will drive, or the major categories of mechanisms that will drive natural selection in a particular direction. There are some other mechanisms that will drive evolution in addition to natural selection. Other mechanisms so evolution is not necessarily natural selection, but natural selection will drive evolution. Evolution is just the overall change in species over time. Natural selection is a tool through which that occurs, where specific individuals are more likely to reproduce and pass their genetics on to the next generation. That's natural selection. Evolution is a little bigger picture. There's some other things that can affect evolution in addition to natural selection. One of those is what we call genetic drift. And that's where, for whatever reason, allele frequencies will change due to random chance. Honestly, the coronavirus pandemic will likely have a genetic drift effect on the human race. It will be, and we don't know what that will look like. I'm not saying, I'm not trying to make any guesses as to what that would look like. That's not my line of study. That's not what I'm going to get into. But I would suggest to you it's a large random chance event that is going to have some impact. For example, any event, natural disaster, disease, anything like that eliminates a significant portion of the population. There may be specific alleles within that portion of the population that gets eliminated. And those alleles then occur at a different frequency in the next generation, for example. Right? So here they're just saying, well, it's instead of an even number of red and blue bugs, if a certain number of blue bugs happens to get through random chance taken out of the population, then the next generation will have that selection as well. Yes, sir. Question?
With the genetic drift and the allele frequency change, your example of coronavirus, is that say that the change in the frequency of allele just based on a boom or an increase in a specific population that all have those same alleles, i.e.
You can.
SWAT and half the blue are gone.
Yes, you can. It could be, so it can be one of two things. It could be something that's directly related to an individual's ability to survive the coronavirus. That's one possibility. Or it could just be simply something random that is
Caused a boom in a specific aspect of the population.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, it's a random change, but it's some big event that removes the allele. It decreases the variation available, the alleles that are available in the population. So there could be certain alleles in the population that gets eliminated through the individuals that are targeted by the random event. In the future population, those alleles are no longer present, or at least present at a much lower percentage. So the population moving forward looks different. Right? Two main categories of that we can point to, one being the founder effect. That's where you have some migration where a group of organisms moves to a different colony or a different location, but maybe not all of the alleles, not all of the genotypes are represented in the founder population. So now the new founder population will take on probably a different look over enough generations where those recessive alleles that were present are no longer present. The bottleneck effect, we see this in the cheetah population. Most cheetahs there's not a lot of genetic variation in the cheetah population that survives some catastrophic bottleneck event. So we're not sure what it was. We have no record of it. We just know when you look at the genomes of one cheetah to the next, they're almost identical clones. There's just no variation. So that is a species that has survived a bottleneck effect. The one challenge with the species that's on the other side of that bottleneck effect is if the prevailing remaining population is susceptible to some disease or something like that, it can actually have a catastrophic effect on the population that remains. But again, over time, right, you have this large population, and then something catastrophic decimates the population, where just a very limited number of alleles show up in the individuals that survive. Then as this population begins to grow back out, it's going to be much less diverse than the original population was. And it will take time for random mutations to build up in the population to establish enough genetic variety in later generations. And if we're talking about something like a keystone species, like a large predator, those populations are often small. There's not a lot of opportunity for them to generate genetic diversity through large numbers anyway. Another factor, of course, is very few species show complete random mating. We've already talked about sexual selection within natural selection, but there are also social structures. Most great ape species exhibit some sort of social structures. The bonobos being an exception to that. They will mate randomly with each other. But a lot of primate species will typically have, and a lot of mammalian species, honestly, will typically have an alpha, either male and or female, that are the predominant reproducers within a larger social group. And that will very much limit the genetics that get passed on to the next generation, limits the variation. It works very well in some species. Gorillas, meerkats, hyenas. Hyenas are actually matriarch. The females are in charge in those societies, but it's very strong societal drivers as well. Nice video here. This is in your text. It's a long watch. We won't watch it in class, 19 minutes. I've included the link for you here, but it does show up in your text. I think it's section 18.2. Okay? I learned something new about this, right? They're talking about fossil records just in the last few decades, about actually being able to track where feathers began to show up. And feathers the current prevailing theory, and again, it's new, it's so new, current prevailing theory is that the feathers were not originally evolved specifically for flight. Feathers came first, flight came later. And they make a really strong case that from particular species of dinosaurs is what we see modern day birds have evolved. Right? Anyway, again, just the last few years we've discovered more fossil records. That's what I've got, guys. You guys have a good rest of your week. I'll see you Wednesday.